presentation is going to go through these phylums in a bit more detail. We're going to talk about sponges, and we're going to look at some specific sponge anatomy. After the phylum Porifera is the phylum Cnidaria, and the phylum Cnidaria has jellyfish and corals, and really the thing that makes it stand apart is that it has nematocysts, so it has stinging tentacles. But we're actually going to look at sponge anatomy a little bit closer. So a sponge anatomy, the cells that we focus on are the amoebocytes. And the amoebocytes are cells within the sponge that are very similar to amoebas. And so that would be this part right there. It has an osculum, which is where the water flows out through. There's these choanocytes. These are collar cells. And if you look at these little collar cells, you'll see that they have a flagella there. And so these choanocytes are responsible for basically moving water through the sponge. So the sponge comes in through this in-current pore, and then these collar cells basically wave these flagella around, and it moves the water in throughout this. Another important part of sponge anatomy is the spicule. And the spicule are, if you look right here, you'll see these little structures in here that look kind of like spikes, and it basically gives the sponge its structure or its form. And so these little spicules, sometimes they even look like glass, but they give the sponge its form. All right, so we're going to talk about flatworms. And flatworms are in the phylum Platyhelminths. And this is a diagram of a planarian. And I want to show you this because flatworms, they have a very simple anatomy, but we're starting to see a little bit more complexity. We see a cephalization. So that's the first thing that we notice with the flatworms. It has a head region, and the head region has sensory organs. So we see the eye spots, and these planarians don't really see, but they can sense light from these eye spots. It has a sensory lobe right here, so another sensory organ on the head region. And the ganglia is really what we would call a primitive brain. It's not necessarily a brain, but it is a collection of nerve cells that are concentrated in the head region. And then we'll see this nerve that runs all the way throughout the body, okay? They also have a pharynx and a mouth. So the mouth is not located in the head region the way we're used to seeing, but we do see a mouth and a pharynx. And a pharynx is what moves things from the mouth into the body. And then once it moves these nutrients in here, there's really just this open gastrovascular cavity is what we would call it. So that's where the digestion is going to take place, but it's not very specialized in this organism. And then we move to the next phylum, and these are the roundworms, and these are unsegmented worms, so they would be smooth. They have a pseudocoelom, and a pseudocoelom means a false cavity. So coelom is basically where there is this cavity within the body, and it contains the organs. And so a lot of advanced animals have an actual coelom, whereas roundworms, they have this body cavity, but it's a little bit false. It doesn't really contain organs like we would see in a true coelom. Roundworms mostly cause disease. They're mostly parasitic. Trichinosis is a very good example of a roundworm. This is, it's basically a worm, and it forms cysts in muscles and mostly in pigs. So this is very common in pork. And this is one of the reasons why you want to cook your food well, because if you don't cook your pork very well and it has one of these cysts, then that cyst is going to be inside of you when you eat that, and then it can reproduce inside of you, and it can cause really bad pain if it gets into your muscles. All right, the next one is the phylum Annelida, and this is the segmented worms. So these are the earthworms that you've seen. They have a true coelom. It includes earthworms, marine worms. So if you look at this picture on the right-hand side, that's a feather duster. That's actually a marine worm. And then the leeches are also in this phylum. And we're going to look at some anatomy here up closer because the earthworm, we are really starting to see some complexity in structures. All right, so if we follow this through, the mouth is right here. And so we definitely have a cephalization because we have a head region. It includes the mouth and it includes this cerebral ganglion. So we still have a primitive brain, but we have this collection of nerve cells that leads to a nerve cord that runs throughout the body. So you see this right here is a nerve cord. Okay. From the mouth, we have a pharynx. So this large part right here is the pharynx. And then if you look as it runs back along here, that's the esophagus. So that is going to move nutrients from the pharynx through. And they're going to move through here until they reach the crop. And so the crop is this large segment right here. And the crop is really where the soil is going to be moved around, and basically it's a place to kind of store the dirt and the nutrients until they move into the gizzard. And the gizzard right in here, this large region back here, the gizzard is going to really mix that around and start to pull out the nutrients from the dirt and the soil that the earthworm has ingested. And then that goes into the intestine and eventually moves out through the anus, which would be at the end of the worm. All right, we also have a circulatory system here. So these are aortic arches. So these basically are hearts. So there's several aortic arches here. These would be hearts. And then you'll see that you have a ventral blood vessel and you have a dorsal blood vessel. So you have a system for moving oxygen throughout the earthworm. And down here for reproduction, you'll see these are seminal receptacles. So right here, these receive sperm from a different earthworm. Okay? And then nephridia, this over here, nephridia, these help excrete wastes. All right, the next one is the mollusks, and mollusks means soft. So a mollusk is a soft body. It has an internal or an external shell. So we have snails and slugs, squid, octopus. The body plan, really, it has a foot and a mantle that covers the body. Most of these animals have a shell, except for slugs. And then there's this visceral mass, which is just the internal organs. So gastropods are the snails, the slugs, the limpets, and the nudibranchs. Bivalves are mollusks that have two shells. And then we have the cephalopods, and these are the octopi and the squids. They have a soft body, and their foot is divided into tentacles. So the cephalopods, we see actual tentacles. And the squid have a modified shell. It's called a pen, but it's internal rather than external. Cephalopods have well-developed eyes, and they're the most complex of the mollusks. All right, we're going to move on to arthropods, and this is a vast phylum of animals. There are an incredible amount of different animals and diversity within this phylum. But their main characteristics that they share is that they have jointed appendages. So appendages would be kind of what we would consider arms or legs. It's anything coming off of the main body. They have a segmented body. So sometimes they have 3 segments, sometimes they just have 2. They all have an exoskeleton. So their skeleton is on the outside of their body. They have mandibles, so they have chewing mouth parts. And they all go through a metamorphosis. So they have an egg, a larva, and an adult stage. So the chelicerates are the spiders and the scorpions. And chelicerates, especially the spiders, they have 2 segments. So they have what we call a cephalothorax, which means their head and thorax are fused. And so that would be one segment. And then they have an abdomen that is the other segment. They have 8 legs, and their chelicerae are modified into fangs. So this front, basically kind of mandibles right here, are called chelicerae, and they're modified into fangs in spiders. Then they also have an organ at the back of them that is called a spinneret, and it allows them to spin a web. We're going to look at crustaceans in a little bit more detail. Crayfish is an animal that is often dissected within a biology class. And so when we look at a crayfish, we're looking at internal and external anatomy. So this is the head region. And so we see an eye and a rostrum coming over the eye that protects it. They have an antenna, which is quite large. They have modified appendages. So this cheliped here is the first leg. So it's that largest appendage. They have walking legs. And then back here on this abdomen region, they have what's called swimmerets that help them move through the water. And then this very back part is called a uropod. Now, as far as their internal anatomy, we see an increasing complexity. So they have a mouth, and it leads to an esophagus, and then to a rather large stomach. That stomach leads to an intestine, and you'll see that intestine moves all the way through the crayfish and to the anus, where it excretes wastes. They have other specialized structures. So they have a heart, and then you'll see this dorsal artery, and that allows them to move oxygen throughout the crayfish. We also see that the crayfish has a liver. So the liver has become part of its system. And so very specialized structures within the crayfish. Centipedes and millipedes are also arthropods. So centipedes are predators, and many of them are poisonous. They have 1 pair of legs per segment. Millipedes are actually herbivores, but they have 2 pairs of legs per segment. And then the insects as a whole are part of arthropods, and insects have 3 pairs of legs and 1 pair of antennae. And they always have 3 body sections. So on insects, you'll see a head, you'll see a thorax, and you'll see an abdomen region.